I'm Iris Callahan. And 3 nights ago, I walked into my Seattle apartment expecting silence and routine, only to find a plain envelope lying just inside my door, as if someone had slipped it through the gap and vanished before I arrived. I picked it up with the kind of hesitation you reserve for things that feel wrong on contact. And the moment I unfolded the single sheet inside, my own name stared back at me in a font I recognized far too well. "He's still saying these things about you," the note whispered in small handwriting beneath the printed email. And the words felt like a hand tightening around my throat. I said aloud, "Who sent this?" even though the hallway behind me answered with nothing but the hum of my refrigerator. I set the paper on my kitchen counter, reading the message again. And each line carried the same clipped tone my father used whenever he wanted to sound factual while hiding something vindictive. "Avoid working with her if you can." He had written to a contractor on the East Coast. "Stress makes her unpredictable." And the blunt confidence of those sentences hit me harder than the accusation itself. I muttered. He didn't even hesitate. And the sound of my own voice felt strange in the quiet room. The fact that the email was dated only 2 weeks earlier made my hands shake in a way I hadn't felt since the night he threw me out. I called my brother Darren because he was the only person who might know whether that email was an isolated burst of spite or part of something larger. And he answered on the third ring with a voice that already carried guilt. "Darren." "Did you send me something?" I asked. And he exhaled like someone bracing for an impact he'd seen coming for years. "No," he said. "But if you got an email like that, then Dad hasn't stopped." "Iris." His hesitation pressed heavier than the words themselves, because it told me he'd heard versions of this long before the printed page reached my door. I looked back at the envelope. Its flap unsealed and crooked as though whoever delivered it had acted fast. And something in that carelessness made my stomach turn. "Someone wanted me to see this," I said quietly. And saying it out loud made the truth settle into place with an unsettling clarity. Darren asked, "Do you recognize the handwriting?" And I told him no. Because the note was anonymous and written in a rushed slant I didn't recognize from anyone in my family. When I hung up, the apartment felt smaller than it had an hour earlier, as if the envelope itself had shrunk the room by reminding me that distance never guaranteed safety. The next morning, I carried the printed email into my firm's conference room because I needed to know whether the damage had already reached my professional life. And the tension in Mark Elwood's voice as he greeted me told me the answer before I sat down. He glanced at the paper in my hand and said, "I was going to bring this up, Iris, because someone contacted me last week with concerns about your stability under pressure." I felt the words settle like grit in my teeth. And I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner, while he rubbed the bridge of his nose and muttered that he'd hoped it was just rumor. The fact that his eyes drifted toward the email proved he recognized its tone. "Not as rumor, but as something rehearsed," I told him. "That message came from my father." And Mark's shoulders stiffened as if the name alone explained every unanswered question he'd been carrying since he received the warning. He said, "It wasn't the first time someone's tried to steer me away from you." And the phrasing made the room feel narrower because it meant this wasn't an isolated hit. I pressed him for details. And he admitted that a contractor in Connecticut had hinted I was unpredictable, echoing the exact terminology printed on the page between us. The rhythm of those repeated words felt deliberate, like someone had handed out a script. When I walked out of the conference room, the email felt heavier than it had the night before, because now it wasn't just proof of sabotage. It was evidence that the sabotage had traveled farther than I'd ever imagined. I called Darren again and told him exactly what Mark had said. And Darren's quiet inhale was sharp enough to tell me he'd heard that phrasing before. "Iris. He's been telling people that for years," he said. And there was no hesitation in his voice this time. I asked him why no one had stopped it. And he answered softly that no one confronts a man who sounds sure of himself. I stood in the hallway and looked through the glass wall at my colleagues, discussing a project I'd fought hard to lead. And the realization that my father had been speaking over me, even from another coast, made my jaw tighten. I whispered, "He's rewriting who I am." And hearing it out loud made the truth fall into place with a clarity I couldn't unhear. Darren asked what I was going to do now, and I told him I didn't know yet. Only that ignoring it was no longer an option. By the time I hung up, the hallway felt colder, shaped by the knowledge that a lie can travel farther than a person when repeated often enough. I left the East Coast for Seattle because I needed a place where my father's voice couldn't outrun me. And the 2 suitcases I dragged into my new apartment felt like the only parts of my life he hadn't shaped. On my first day at the experiential design firm, Dr. Maeve Hollister studied my portfolio with a focus that made the room feel smaller. And her eyes paused on the piece I almost didn't include. "You build from wounds, not templates," she noted while flipping the page. And the comment landed with a precision that startled me. I asked if that was good or bad, and her faint smile suggested it was both. I spent the following months learning that this field rewarded instinct as much as structure. And my instinct carried more history than training. During one late review session, Maeve tapped the corner of a concept drawing and remarked, "This idea isn't timid, but you're treating it like it might break." And the observation cut through me more cleanly than criticism ever could. I told her I wasn't afraid of risk. Though my hand tightened around the pen in a way that betrayed me, she let the silence answer for us both, leaving me alone with the tension I'd been pretending not to feel. Eventually, I volunteered for projects no one else wanted because they forced me past the edges I'd been guarding. And each deadline weighed differently than the last. When Mark assigned me to lead a pitch for a national retailer, he asked if I was ready, and the look in his eyes suggested he wasn't asking about the project. "Ready enough," I replied while the proposal folder warmed in my grip. And he nodded as though he'd been waiting to hear whether I'd claim the moment. The pitch succeeded, and the client's handshake held the certainty I'd spent years earning in silence. By the end of that year, my work carried its own reputation inside the firm, and people began expecting outcomes from me instead of explanations. Maeve stopped me in the hallway one afternoon and observed, "You walk like someone who trusts herself now." And the truth of it echoed more loudly than the compliment. I answered that Seattle had given me room to breathe, though the shift clearly came from choices I'd made rather than the city itself. As I returned to my desk, the familiar hum of design reviews and quiet ambition reminded me that this new version of my life was finally being authored by me alone. When my mother called to say she was in Seattle and needed to see me, her voice carried a stiffness that didn't belong to casual visits. And I met her outside a small cafe near my apartment because she insisted it couldn't wait. She opened her purse with hands that kept brushing the edges of the zipper and whispered, "I brought something for you. And you're not going to like where it came from." I asked what she meant, and she placed a USB drive between us like it was heavier than metal. "Every message your father sent about you is on this," she murmured, and the tremor in her breath made it clear she'd rehearsed that line for days. I reached for the drive and paused, because the look in her eyes wasn't fear of him anymore, but fear of finally being the one to expose what she'd watched happen. She whispered, "I know I should have stopped him, but I didn't know how." And her gaze dropped to her lap as though the confession was something she'd been holding behind her ribs. I told her I didn't understand why she had any of his correspondence. And she answered, "Because he never changed his passwords, and I learned them long before he realized I could." Her voice thinned as she added that scrolling through the conversations had taken her months. Not because of the volume, but because of how each line made her feel complicit. She leaned forward as if closing the distance might soften the blow and said, "He told everyone you were unstable. Iris." And he used those same words in every email. I felt the air shift as she explained that some of the messages were sent to people I'd never even met. And I asked her how long she'd been gathering them. 10 years, she confessed. and the weight of that number settled between us like a second table. She didn't look up until she added, "I kept hoping he'd stop so I wouldn't have to give this to you." But he never did. When she finally lifted her face, her expression held something brittle and breaking, and she murmured, "I'm sorry I didn't leave sooner, but I was too afraid of what he'd do if I confronted him." I told her fear made sense in a house where silence was the only safe language, and her eyes filled with relief that looked almost like grief. She pressed my hand and whispered, "Do whatever you need to do with it, because this no longer belongs to him or to me." As she stood to leave, the USB remained on the table, and its cold shape in my palm later that night made clear that nothing about my past had been exaggerated at all. The nomination email arrived on a Tuesday morning with my coffee still too hot to drink, and reading my name listed for the National Experiential Design Award left me frozen long enough for Mark to ask whether I was breathing. I told him, "Portland feels bigger than anything I've done," and he replied that recognition only finds people who have already earned it, not those waiting for permission. As the news traveled across the firm, Maeve stopped by my desk and murmured, "You've been writing this chapter for years. Now you get to read it out loud." I nodded, even though my pulse was uneven, because there was no undoing what acceptance required from me now. The night of the ceremony in Portland carried a hum that didn't belong to nerves but to inevitability. And while the audience settled, I slipped the anonymous note from my pocket because holding it steadied my hands. When the announcer read my name and I walked toward the stage, I felt the weight of 10 years press across my shoulders without crushing me, just reminding me why I was standing there. I began with a simple acknowledgement before lifting the note and saying, "This came to my door weeks ago, and whoever left it believed I deserved to know the truth." A hush rippled through the room as I added, "The truth is that someone very close to me spent years telling a story about who I was, hoping I'd never correct it." I opened the printed email from the USB and read, "Avoid working with her if possible. She doesn't handle pressure well." And the familiarity of the phrasing drew a sharp breath from someone in the front row. "This was written by my father." I continued, "And it wasn't the only message he sent about me," letting each word land without apology. I told the audience that deception doesn't always come from strangers. And sometimes the most damaging narratives come from people who assume they own the right to define you. The room stayed still as I explained that for a decade. My career had been shadowed by a man who feared what I might become without his control. I folded the paper and said, "I'm speaking now because silence was the only thing that ever protected him, not me." And the clarity in my voice surprised even me. I shared that my mother had gathered every message, not out of spite but out of fear of what continued denial would cost the rest of us. She chose to stop being afraid. I added, "And so did I," letting the two statements echo against each other with the finality they deserved. A few people shifted in their seats, not in discomfort but in recognition, and the awareness carried more weight than applause ever could. When I finished, the ceremony resumed, but the energy in the room no longer felt celebratory. It felt aligned, as if everyone understood that awards were never the point of evenings like this. As I walked off stage, Mark pressed a hand to my shoulder and whispered, "You didn't just accept a nomination, you reclaimed your name." Maeve joined us and observed that transparency, when spoken plainly, has its own architecture. And I let her words settle because they fit the moment with quiet precision. Later, as the hall lights dimmed and conversations drifted into softer tones, I realized the story my father built had finally collapsed under the weight of my own voice. The drive back to my hotel cut through Portland's cold night air, and for the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for what might come next but absorbing what had already changed. I held the note again and whispered, "Whoever sent this, you were right, I did need to know." And the admission felt like stepping into a room I'd spent years avoiding. I didn't know whether the message would ever reach the person who left it, but the gesture had already done its work by breaking open something that had once felt sealed shut. As I unlocked my door, I understood with steady certainty that the story moving forward would be mine alone to tell. In the weeks after the Portland ceremony, the calls from Connecticut came in uneven waves, and Darren was the first to tell me that the contractors who once echoed my father's stories had stopped returning his messages. He told me, "People finally saw the emails for themselves, and they're keeping their distance." And the strain in his voice carried both shock and a quiet reckoning. I asked whether our father understood the shift, and Darren answered that understanding wasn't the point anymore because consequences had arrived without needing his permission. Hearing that left me with a steadiness I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but release. The kind that comes when truth no longer hides in back rooms. My mother called next, and her tone held a firmness I'd never heard from her, as if every word rested on ground she had just claimed for herself. "I filed the separation papers today," she told me, explaining that a decade of watching the fallout was enough for one lifetime. I asked if she was scared, and she replied, "Of course, but not of him, of how long I waited to choose myself." Her certainty reached me more deeply than any apology ever could, because it was built on an action she finally allowed her own name to sit beside. At the firm, life didn't explode into celebration. Instead, it shifted into alignment. A quiet recognition of work that had been speaking long before I took the stage in Portland. Mark pulled me aside to tell me the partners were discussing expanding leadership. And he asked, "If the opportunity comes, are you willing to take it?" And I answered yes, because the hesitation that once clouded every step had loosened its grip. Maeve later observed that growth often sounds like calm rather than applause. And the truth of that settled into my chest with unexpected warmth. The days moved forward without spectacle, which somehow made the progress feel even more real. One evening, as rain softened against my window, my mother called again just to say she'd found a small apartment she liked, and her voice carried a lightness that reminded me of a door opening. She told me, "I'm learning how to live without waiting for him to speak first." And something in the way she said it made the room around me feel larger. I whispered that she deserved a life that answered to her instead of to fear, and she exhaled as if hearing it allowed her to believe it. When we hung up, the quiet that followed wasn't empty anymore. It felt like a beginning neither of us had known how to imagine before. As I look back on everything that unfolded, I'm grateful you stayed with me through this journey. If any part of my story echoed a piece of your own, I hope you'll share a thought or two with me. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Here's to finding steadier days ahead.